The morning mist clung to the gates of Windsor Castle like a protective shroud, but nothing could shield Sergeant James Morrison from what was about to unfold. For 15 years, he had stood at attention, watching the world pass by through iron bars and stone walls. He had seen dignitaries come and go, witnessed historic moments from his post, and maintained his stoic demeanor through every royal protocol imaginable. But, on this particular Tuesday in September, two small figures would shatter his carefully constructed walls of professional distance and change not just his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve. James had always believed that a guard's duty was simple: protect, observe, and remain invisible. He never imagined that his greatest challenge wouldn't come from foreign threats or security breaches, but from a 7-year-old princess with pigtails who refused to walk past him without saying good morning, and her 9-year-old brother who had developed an unusual fascination with military history. What started as innocent childhood curiosity would evolve into something far more profound, a connection that would test every rule in the royal handbook and force James to choose between the rigid traditions he had sworn to uphold and the genuine human bonds that were quietly forming behind palace walls. In a world where every interaction is scripted and every emotion carefully contained, sometimes it takes the unfiltered honesty of children to reveal what truly matters. This is the story of how two young royals and one dedicated guard discovered that the most important walls are not the ones that keep people out, but the ones we tear down to let people in. The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves through the gates of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his scarlet tunic for the 100th time that morning. His reflection in the polished buckles of his uniform showed a man who had perfected the art of invisibility, eyes straight ahead, expression neutral, posture rigid as the stone walls he protected. At 38, James had spent more than half his adult life standing guard at various royal residences, and he wore his dedication like armor. The morning routine was sacred to him. Up at 5:30, breakfast consumed in mechanical silence, uniform inspection that would satisfy the most demanding drill sergeant, and arrival at his post precisely 15 minutes before his shift began. James treated each day like a military operation because, in many ways, it was. The royal family's security depended on guards like him maintaining absolute professionalism, and James had never been one to disappoint. His colleagues often joked that James had been carved from the same stone as the castle walls. During his 15 years of service, he had never been late, never broken protocol, and never allowed personal feelings to interfere with his duties. When other guards shared stories about funny interactions with visitors or casual conversations with palace staff, James remained silent. His job was to observe, protect, and maintain the invisible barrier between the royal family and the outside world. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the courtyard as James settled into his familiar rhythm. He knew every sound the castle made, the way footsteps echoed differently in the morning dampness, how the ancient stones creaked as they warmed, the distant hum of activity from the staff quarters. These sounds formed the backdrop of his existence, as constant and reliable as his own heartbeat. James had chosen this life deliberately. After serving 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Coldstream Guards, civilian life had felt chaotic and unpredictable. The rigid structure of royal service offered something his war-weary soul craved: order, purpose, and clear boundaries. Here, he knew exactly what was expected of him every single day. There were no moral gray areas, no split-second decisions that could haunt him for years afterward. Just rules, protocols, and the comforting weight of tradition. His personal life reflected this same desire for simplicity. A small flat in Windsor, meals eaten alone while reading military history books, weekends spent maintaining his equipment or visiting his elderly mother in Surrey. James had tried dating a few times over the years, but relationships required the kind of emotional flexibility that felt foreign to him now. It was easier to focus on his duties, to find satisfaction in small victories like a perfectly executed uniform inspection or a shift completed without incident. The other guards had their theories about James's solitary nature. Some thought he was hiding a broken heart, others assumed he was naturally antisocial. The truth was simpler and more complex. James had learned to find peace in solitude after witnessing too much chaos in the world. The castle walls didn't just protect the royal family, they protected him from the unpredictable messiness of human connection. This particular morning felt no different from the thousands that had come before it. James positioned himself at his assigned post near the family's private entrance, a location that required the highest level of discretion and professionalism. From here, he could observe the comings and goings of the immediate royal family while maintaining the respectful distance that protocol demanded. It was a position of trust that he had earned through years of unwavering reliability. The first few hours passed in familiar silence. Staff members hurried past with their heads down, acknowledging his presence with subtle nods that he returned with barely perceptible movements. Delivery personnel presented their credentials with nervous efficiency, understanding that this particular guard was not one for small talk or casual pleasantries. James preferred it this way, interactions that were brief, professional, and forgettable. Around mid-morning, the usual calm was broken by the sound of children's laughter echoing from somewhere deep within the castle. The sound was muffled by thick walls and heavy doors, but it carried a lightness that seemed to float through the ancient corridors like music. James had heard similar sounds before. The castle was, after all, home to young Prince George and Princess Charlotte, but he had trained himself to tune out such distractions. His job was to focus on potential threats, not family moments. The laughter grew closer, accompanied by the quick patter of small feet on marble floors. James maintained his forward gaze, but his peripheral vision caught movement near the private entrance. Two small figures appeared in the doorway, a boy with sandy hair wearing a navy blazer and a girl in a blue dress with her hair pulled back in neat pigtails. Prince George and Princess Charlotte, he realized, though he had never been this close to them during their informal moments. Protocol dictated that James should remain motionless and avoid eye contact unless specifically addressed by a senior member of the royal family. Children, regardless of their position in the line of succession, were not considered senior members for these purposes. James kept his eyes fixed on the middle distance, prepared to let the young royals pass without acknowledgement, as he had been trained to do. But something unexpected happened. Instead of hurrying past as children usually did when confronted with an imposing guard in full regalia, Princess Charlotte stopped walking. She stood about 3 feet away from James, her head tilted to one side as she studied his uniform with undisguised curiosity. Her brother, noticing her sudden halt, stopped as well and followed her gaze. "Look at all those buttons," Princess Charlotte whispered to her brother, but loudly enough for James to hear. "Do you think they're real gold?" Prince George stepped closer, his 9-year-old mind clearly working to process the details of James's appearance. "The red coat is called a tunic," he said with the authority of someone who had been studying military history. "And those are the Queen's colors on his shoulder." James felt an unexpected flutter of something, pride, perhaps, or simple human recognition at being seen as more than just a fixture in the landscape. But he maintained his position, fighting the urge to glance down at the children who were now discussing him as if he were a museum display. "Do you think he ever smiles?" Charlotte asked her brother, her voice carrying the innocent curiosity that only children possess. "Guards aren't supposed to smile while they're on duty," George replied knowledgeably. "But I bet he's nice when he's not working." The conversation continued for several minutes, with the children speculating about various aspects of James's uniform, his possible background, and whether he ever got tired standing so still for so long. James found himself listening despite his training, caught off guard by their genuine interest and the kindness in their observations. Most adults barely glanced at him, these children were treating him like a person worth understanding. Eventually, a nanny appeared and gently guided the children away, reminding them that they had lessons waiting. As their voices faded back into the depths of the castle, James felt something shift inside his chest, a tiny crack in the armor he had spent years constructing. For just a few minutes, he had been seen not as an obstacle or a piece of furniture, but as a human being worthy of curiosity and consideration. The rest of his shift passed quietly, but James found his thoughts returning to the brief encounter. He replayed the children's words, analyzing their tone and intention with the same thoroughness he applied to security protocols. There had been no mockery in their voices, no attempt to test his resolve or break his concentration. They had simply noticed him in a way that felt both innocent and profound. As his replacement arrived for the evening shift, James went through his usual end-of-duty routine. He provided a brief status report, noting nothing unusual to report, though he found himself hesitating for a moment, wondering if a casual encounter with young royals qualified as noteworthy. Deciding it did not, he completed his handover and made his way toward the staff exit. Walking through the castle corridors toward the changing room, James caught himself listening for the sound of children's voices. The realization bothered him more than he cared to admit. In 15 years of service, he had never allowed himself to become emotionally invested in the lives of those he protected. His job was to be a guardian, not a participant in their daily experiences. But, as he changed out of his uniform and folded it with military precision, James couldn't shake the memory of Princess Charlotte's tilted head and Prince George's earnest explanations about military protocol. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, their brief attention had made him feel more visible than he had in years. It was a dangerous feeling for someone whose entire career depended on remaining professionally invisible. The drive home to his small flat was accomplished in his usual contemplative silence, but tonight his thoughts were less organized than usual. Instead of mentally reviewing the day's security observations or planning tomorrow's preparations, James found himself wondering what the children might be doing now. Were they having dinner with their parents? Working on homework? Playing games that only made sense to young minds? These were not the kind of thoughts that belonged in a professional guard's mental space, and James knew it. As he prepared his simple dinner and settled into his evening routine, he made a conscious decision to compartmentalize the day's unusual encounter. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another opportunity to demonstrate his professionalism and reliability. Whatever momentary connection he had felt with the young royals would remain exactly that, momentary. But, as James lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his Spartan bedroom, he found sleep more elusive than usual. In the quiet darkness, he could still hear Princess Charlotte's whispered question echoing in his mind, "Do you think he ever smiles?" The innocent inquiry had revealed something he hadn't realized about himself, that somewhere beneath his carefully constructed professional facade, he had forgotten how to be genuinely happy. The last thought that crossed James's mind before finally drifting off to sleep was a question of his own: when had protecting others begun to require protecting himself from them? It was a question that would prove more significant than he could possibly imagine, setting the stage for changes that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, connection, and the true meaning of service. The following morning arrived with the same precision as every other day in James's carefully ordered existence. His alarm sounded at 5:30, his breakfast consisted of toast and black coffee consumed while reading yesterday's security briefings, and his uniform inspection revealed not a single thread out of place. Yet something felt different as he walked through the castle gates, a subtle shift in his awareness that he couldn't quite identify. James took his position at the private entrance with his usual military bearing, but found himself more conscious of the sounds emanating from within the castle. The familiar echoes of staff preparing for the day seemed somehow more distinct, as if his hearing had been recalibrated overnight. When the distant sound of children's voices drifted through the corridors, he felt his attention sharpen in a way that both surprised and concerned him. The morning proceeded according to its established rhythm until approximately 10:15, when Princess Charlotte appeared in the doorway wearing a yellow sweater and carrying what appeared to be a small notebook. She was alone this time, moving with the purposeful determination that children display when they have made an important decision. Instead of passing by, she stopped directly in front of James and looked up at his face with unwavering directness. "Good morning," she said with the formal politeness that had clearly been drilled into her by countless etiquette lessons. "I hope you slept well." James felt every muscle in his body tense as he struggled with competing instincts. Protocol demanded that he maintain his position and avoid engagement, but 15 years of military training had also taught him that ignoring a direct address from any member of the royal family, regardless of age, was equally inappropriate. He solved his dilemma by offering the smallest possible nod, a gesture so subtle it could barely be called acknowledgement. Princess Charlotte seemed to interpret this microscopic movement as encouragement. She opened her notebook and consulted what appeared to be a list written in careful, childish handwriting. "I have some questions about being a guard, if that's okay," she announced. "I'm doing a project for school about different jobs, and I thought you might know more about guarding than anyone else." The innocence of her request hit James like a physical force. Here was a 7-year-old princess treating him not as an ornamental fixture, but as an expert worthy of consultation. Her notebook contained a neat list of questions, each one preceded by a small bullet point drawn with obvious care. The sight of her earnest preparation stirred something in James's chest that he hadn't felt in years, the simple pleasure of being needed for his knowledge rather than just his presence. But recognizing the feeling only made it more dangerous. James had survived 15 years in royal service by maintaining absolute emotional boundaries, and he couldn't afford to compromise them now, regardless of how endearing the threat might be. He remained motionless, hoping that his lack of response would discourage further interaction. Princess Charlotte, however, possessed the persistence that seemed to be a family trait. She consulted her notebook again and asked, "How long do you have to stand in the same spot? My legs get tired after just a few minutes during our standing lessons." The question was so practical, so genuinely curious, that James found himself calculating an answer despite his determination to remain silent. A 4-hour shift with brief rotation breaks, he thought, though the exact timing varied depending on circumstances. The information felt harmless enough to share, but sharing it would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Before James could resolve his internal debate, Prince George appeared beside his sister, slightly out of breath as if he had been running to catch up. "There you are," he said to Charlotte with the exasperated tone of an older brother. "You can't just wander off to interview guards without telling anyone." "I'm not interviewing," Charlotte protested. "I'm just asking questions for my school project." "And he seems very knowledgeable." George looked up at James with an expression that mixed curiosity with a more mature understanding of social boundaries. At 9, he had clearly absorbed more of the complex protocols that governed royal interactions. "I'm sorry if my sister is bothering you," he said with the formal politeness that had been trained into him from birth. "She gets excited about her projects and forgets about proper procedures sometimes." James felt another unexpected flutter of emotion, this time, something that might have been amusement if he had allowed it to fully form. The idea that a 7-year-old's genuine curiosity could be classified as a breach of proper procedures highlighted the absurdity of a system that prioritized protocol over human connection. But amusement, like all other personal reactions, was a luxury he couldn't afford while on duty. Charlotte was undeterred by her brother's gentle correction. She held up her notebook like evidence in her defense. "Mrs. Henderson said we should talk to people who actually do the jobs we're writing about. She said second-hand information isn't as good as primary sources." "Primary sources," George repeated with the patient tone of someone who had heard this argument before. "But, Charlotte, guards aren't supposed to talk while they're working." "It's not personal, it's just their job." "But, how am I supposed to learn about their job if I can't ask them about it?" Charlotte replied with the impeccable logic that children often employ to highlight adult inconsistencies. James found himself caught between admiration for the girl's reasoning and alarm at the way the conversation was developing. Every moment they lingered increased the risk that other staff members or, worse, senior royals would witness this breach of protocol. His job depended on maintaining professional distance, but these children were making such distance feel increasingly artificial. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor behind them provided James with a reprieve he hadn't realized he needed. A woman's voice called out, "Prince George, Princess Charlotte, there you are. Your mother would like to see you in the drawing room." The children turned toward the voice, but, before leaving, Princess Charlotte took one more look at James. "I hope I can finish asking you my questions another time," she said with the polite determination of someone who rarely accepted defeat. "I think you would have very interesting answers." As they disappeared back into the castle depths, James felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had challenged his professional composure more than any security incident in recent memory. The children's genuine interest in his work had awakened something in him that he had deliberately suppressed for years: pride in his expertise and a longing for meaningful connection. The rest of the morning passed without incident, giving James time to analyze what had happened and develop strategies for preventing similar situations. He couldn't control when the children might appear, but he could control his responses. Tomorrow, he would be better prepared to maintain appropriate boundaries while still showing the respect due to their positions. But his resolution was tested again the following day when both children returned, this time accompanied by what appeared to be a collection of questions from Princess Charlotte's entire class. She had clearly shared her guard project with her classmates, and they had contributed their own inquiries about everything from the weight of his rifle to whether guards were allowed to use the bathroom during their shifts. "Timothy wants to know if you've ever arrested anyone," Charlotte announced, reading from a fresh page in her notebook. "And Sarah wondered if the big hat is heavy." "Oh, and Marcus asked if you know the Queen personally. George stood beside his sister, clearly torn between fascination with the questions and awareness that this interaction was stretching the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Maybe we should ask someone else these questions, he suggested diplomatically. Like one of the staff who's allowed to talk during work hours. But he's the actual guard, Charlotte replied with irrefutable logic. The other people would just be guessing about guard things. James realized he was witnessing something remarkable, two children navigating the complex social expectations of their world while trying to satisfy their natural curiosity about his. Their conversation revealed an understanding of protocol that was sophisticated for their ages, but also a willingness to challenge those protocols when they seemed to conflict with more fundamental values like learning and respectful inquiry. The situation was resolved when their governess appeared and gently reminded them that their geography lesson was waiting. But before leaving, Princess Charlotte performed a small, formal curtsy in James's direction. "Thank you for listening to my questions, even if you couldn't answer them," she said with a solemnity that made her seem far older than 7. "I hope your job isn't too lonely." The comment hit James with unexpected force. In her innocent observation, the young princess had identified something about his existence that he had never consciously acknowledged: the profound isolation that came with professional invisibility. For 15 years, he had stood guard over the lives of others while remaining fundamentally separate from human connection. It was a loneliness so complete that he had stopped recognizing it as loneliness, accepting it instead as the natural cost of duty. That evening, as James completed his end-of-shift routine, he found himself thinking about Charlotte's final comment. Was his job lonely? The question seemed almost irrelevant. Loneliness was a civilian concern, not something that should occupy the mind of a professional guard. His job was to protect and observe, not to seek companionship or emotional fulfillment. But the seed of the question had been planted, and, over the following days, James found it growing in unexpected ways. He began to notice how other guards interacted with each other during shift changes, the brief jokes, the shared observations about weather or current events, the small moments of human connection that he had always avoided. He observed how staff members smiled at each other in passing, how they asked about families and weekend plans, how they had created a sense of community within the formal structure of palace life. James had convinced himself that his professional isolation was a choice that demonstrated superior dedication. Now he wondered if it might simply be fear, a reluctance to risk the vulnerability that came with genuine human connection. The children's interest in his work had shown him that sharing knowledge and experience could be a form of service too, one that honored his expertise while acknowledging his humanity. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. After years of emotional armor, the prospect of allowing others to see him as a complete person felt like stepping into enemy territory without protection. But it also felt like the first authentic choice he had made in longer than he could remember. When Princess Charlotte appeared the next morning with a small hand-drawn card that read "Thank you for being a good guard," James felt something fundamental shift inside him. The drawing showed a figure in a red coat standing very straight, with a smile carefully added to the face. In her child's understanding of the world, guards could be both professional and happy, dutiful and human. As he accepted the card with the smallest possible nod, still maintaining protocol while acknowledging the gift, James realized that these children were teaching him something he had forgotten during his years of military service and royal duty. They were showing him that the strongest walls were not the ones that kept people out, but the ones that protected what mattered most while still allowing room for connection, growth, and the simple joy of being seen and appreciated for who you truly were. 3 weeks into what James had begun to think of as the children's campaign, the nature of their interactions began to evolve in ways that challenged his understanding of both protocol and human nature. What had started as innocent curiosity about his duties had grown into something more complex, a genuine attempt to include him in their expanding understanding of the world around them. Princess Charlotte had apparently decided that James's inability to respond verbally during his shifts didn't preclude other forms of communication. She began bringing him small drawings that depicted various aspects of castle life, always accompanied by brief explanations of what she had learned in her lessons that day. The drawings were surprisingly observant. She had captured the way morning light fell across the courtyard, the expressions on different staff members' faces, and even the subtle differences between various guards' uniforms. "This one is you on a rainy day," she announced one Tuesday morning, holding up a drawing that showed a red-coated figure standing beneath storm clouds. I noticed you don't move even when it's raining, so I thought you might like to see how brave you look. James felt a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability at being seen so carefully. In her child's perspective, his adherence to duty wasn't just professional obligation, it was a form of courage worthy of artistic documentation. The drawing joined the others in a small collection that he had begun keeping in his locker, though he would have struggled to explain why preserving them felt so important. Prince George's contributions to these morning visits were different but equally engaging. His fascination with military history had led him to research the specific regiments and traditions associated with James's uniform, and he had taken to sharing his discoveries with the enthusiasm of a young scholar. "Did you know that the buttons on your tunic represent battles from the Napoleonic Wars?" he asked one morning, his voice filled with the excitement that came from connecting historical knowledge to real-world observation. "Each pattern tells a story about a different campaign. The one on your collar is from Waterloo." James had known the history of his uniform in a general sense, but George's detailed research revealed connections he had never fully considered. Listening to the 9-year-old prince explain the significance of various military traditions with such genuine interest made James feel proud of the heritage he represented. It also made him realize how rarely anyone had shown such thoughtful curiosity about the meaning behind the symbols he wore every day. These interactions were beginning to attract attention from other castle staff, though not in the way James had initially feared. Rather than viewing the children's interest as a breach of protocol, many seemed to find it endearing. Mrs. Patterson, one of the senior housekeeping staff, had mentioned to James during a brief corridor encounter that the children talked about their guard friend during lessons, and that their enthusiasm for learning about military traditions had impressed their tutors. "It's lovely to see them taking such interest in the people who work here," she had said with a warm smile. "Usually, they barely notice the staff unless they need something. But they speak about you like you're a real person, not just part of the furniture." The comment had stayed with James longer than he expected. The idea that he had become real to the children, while other adults remained furniture, suggested something profound about the way children approached relationships. They seemed capable of seeing past roles and uniforms to the individuals underneath, treating each person as inherently worthy of interest and respect. This realization was reinforced during what became known as the history lesson incident. James was standing at his usual post when he heard raised voices from within the castle, not angry voices, but the kind of animated discussion that indicated passionate disagreement. After several minutes, both children appeared in the doorway, clearly in the middle of a debate about something they considered quite serious. "But that's not what happened at the Battle of Britain," Prince George was saying with the confidence of someone who had done extensive research. "The pilots weren't just brave, they were using specific tactics that most people don't know about." Princess Charlotte looked frustrated in the way that only younger siblings can when they feel outmatched in an argument. "I know they were brave," she replied. "I just think we should also talk about the people on the ground who helped them. Like the guards who protected the air bases." George was about to respond when he noticed James standing nearby. His expression changed as an idea occurred to him. "We could ask someone who actually knows about military things," he suggested, looking directly at James. "I bet he knows about different kinds of soldiers and what they do." Charlotte's face brightened immediately. "That's a brilliant idea. He would know about guards and pilots and all sorts of military people." They both turned toward James with expectant expressions, and he found himself facing a dilemma that no amount of protocol training had prepared him for. The children weren't asking him to break his professional silence for frivolous reasons, they were seeking his expertise to resolve a genuine educational dispute. Their tutors had clearly taught them to value primary sources and expert knowledge, and, in their minds, James represented both. The situation was complicated by the fact that James actually did have relevant knowledge to share. His military background included training in aviation security, and he had served alongside RAF personnel during his deployment years. He understood both the tactical innovations George was referencing and the ground support operations that Charlotte was trying to articulate. In any other context, he would have been happy to help young people learn about military history. But context was everything in royal service, and this particular context placed him in an impossible position. Maintaining his silence would disappoint children who had come to trust him as a source of knowledge and wisdom. Speaking would violate protocols that existed for important reasons related to boundaries and professional distance. Either choice felt like a betrayal of some fundamental principle. James's internal struggle was interrupted by the appearance of their tutor, Ms. Richardson, who had clearly come looking for her missing students. She paused when she saw the tableau, two young royals standing expectantly in front of a motionless guard, obviously waiting for some kind of response to whatever question they had posed. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said with gentle authority, "I believe we need to return to the classroom to continue our history discussion." "But, we were just asking about the Battle of Britain," Charlotte protested. "And, we thought he might know about the guards who protected the airfields." Ms. Richardson glanced at James with an expression that seemed to convey both understanding and sympathy. She was clearly aware of the impossible position the children had placed him in, and equally aware that they had done so with the best of intentions. "That's a very thoughtful approach to research," she told the children diplomatically. "However, we must remember that the guards have specific duties that require their full attention. Perhaps we can find other sources for the information you're seeking." George looked disappointed but nodded his understanding. Charlotte, however, was not ready to abandon her inquiry so easily. "Could we ask him after he finishes work?" she suggested with the problem-solving persistence that seemed to characterize her approach to most obstacles. The question hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption that governed James's professional life. The children were essentially asking if he could exist as a complete person outside of his guard duties if the knowledge and experience he possessed could be shared in a context that honored both their curiosity and his expertise without compromising his professional responsibilities. Ms. Richardson handled the moment with the skill of someone accustomed to navigating complex social situations. "That would depend on many factors that are beyond our control," she said kindly. "For now, let's focus on what we can learn from our books and other available resources." As the tutor guided the children back toward their lessons, Princess Charlotte turned back toward James one final time. "I hope we can learn more about military history together someday," she said with a formality that made her sound far older than 7. "I think you would be an excellent teacher." The word teacher echoed in James's mind long after the children had disappeared from view. In all his years of service, he had thought of himself as a protector, observer, and, occasionally as a deterrent to potential threats. But, he had never considered himself as someone who had knowledge worth sharing or experience that could benefit others. The children's faith in his potential as an educator revealed possibilities he had never imagined. That evening, as James changed out of his uniform and prepared for his solitary journey home, he found himself thinking about teaching in ways that went far beyond military history. The children's questions had shown him that his years of service had given him insights into duty, discipline, tradition, and the complex relationship between individual identity and institutional responsibility. These were not abstract concepts, they were lived experiences that had shaped his character and worldview. For the first time in years, James began to imagine a future that extended beyond his current role. What if there were ways to serve others that didn't require the emotional isolation he had imposed on himself? What if sharing knowledge and experience could be as valuable as standing guard? What if connection and duty were not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary aspects of a more complete form of service? The questions felt dangerous because they suggested possibilities that would require him to step outside the carefully constructed boundaries that had defined his adult life. But they also felt invigorating in ways he hadn't experienced since his early military days, when every challenge had been an opportunity to grow and learn rather than simply another test of his ability to maintain the status quo. As James fell asleep that night, his dreams were filled not with the familiar scenes of castle corridors and security protocols, but with images of children learning, questions being answered, and knowledge being shared in ways that honored both wisdom and wonder. It was a vision of service that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, a reminder of ideals that had drawn him to military life originally, before years of routine had dulled his sense of mission into mere habit. The next morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities to define the kind of person he wanted to be, both in and out of uniform. The children had opened a door in his carefully constructed world, and James was beginning to realize that he had a choice about whether to walk through it. The crisis came on a Thursday morning in early November, arriving with the kind of sudden inevitability that transforms ordinary moments into defining ones. James had been standing at his post for approximately 2 hours when the sound of distressed voices echoed from within the castle, not the usual bustle of staff activity, but something more urgent and concerning. Within minutes, several senior staff members hurried past his position, their expressions grave and purposeful. James maintained his professional demeanor while his trained senses automatically catalogued every detail that might indicate the nature of the emergency. The voices seemed to be coming from the family's private quarters, and the tone suggested medical rather than security concerns. His questions were answered when Dr. Matthews, the family physician, arrived and was quickly escorted inside. The sight of the doctor's black bag and serious expression sent a chill through James that had nothing to do with the November weather. Someone in the royal family was unwell, and the level of staff activity suggested it was serious enough to warrant immediate professional attention. 20 minutes later, Princess Charlotte appeared in the doorway, but she looked nothing like the confident, curious child who had been visiting James for weeks. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, her eyes were red with recent tears, and she moved with the uncertain steps of someone whose world had suddenly become unpredictable. She walked directly to James and stood in front of him, looking up at his face with an expression that mixed desperate hope with crushing disappointment. "My brother is very sick," she said in a small voice that made her seem even younger than her 7 years. "They won't let me see him, and everyone is too busy to explain what's happening." James felt every instinct in his body screaming at him to respond, to offer comfort, to provide reassurance, to somehow ease the fear and confusion he could see in her eyes. But protocol remained protocol, even in moments of family crisis. His job was to maintain his position and professional distance regardless of personal feelings or circumstances. Charlotte waited for several moments, clearly hoping for some kind of acknowledgement or response. When none came, her small face crumpled in a way that made James's chest physically ache. "I thought you were my friend," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought you cared about us." The accusation hit James like a physical blow because it contained a truth he had been desperately trying to ignore. He did care about these children more than was wise, more than was safe, and certainly more than was consistent with his professional obligations. Their daily visits had become the highlight of his shifts, their curiosity and warmth had awakened parts of his personality that he had thought permanently dormant, and their genuine affection had filled emotional spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. But caring and responding were different things, and James remained frozen between his human instincts and his professional training. He watched helplessly as Charlotte's disappointment transformed into something harder and more final, the look of a child learning that adults could not always be trusted to choose compassion over convenience. "I understand now," she said with a dignity that made her seem far older than 7. "You're not really our friend. You're just doing your job, and your job doesn't include caring about people." With that devastating assessment of his character and choices, Charlotte turned and walked back into the castle, leaving James alone with the echo of her words and the crushing weight of his own cowardice. He had spent 15 years building walls between himself and the world, convincing himself that professional distance was a form of strength. Now he realized it might simply be another form of abandonment, a way of avoiding the risk and responsibility that came with genuine human connection. The morning stretched endlessly as James struggled with emotions that felt too large and complex for his carefully ordered mental framework. He had no way of knowing what was wrong with Prince George, no way of offering comfort to Princess Charlotte, and no acceptable way of expressing the depth of his concern for both children. His professional training had prepared him for external threats, but it had left him completely defenseless against the internal crisis of discovering that duty without compassion was simply another form of selfishness. Relief came in an unexpected form around noon, when Captain Williams, James's immediate supervisor, appeared at his post. The captain's expression was serious but not alarmed, and his presence suggested administrative rather than emergency purposes. "Morrison," the captain said with his usual brisk efficiency, "I need to speak with you privately. Corporal Jenkins will take your position while we talk." James followed his supervisor to a small office used for staff meetings, his mind racing through possible explanations for this unusual mid-shift conference. Had someone reported his interactions with the children? Was he being disciplined for some breach of protocol he hadn't recognized? Or was this related to whatever medical emergency was unfolding upstairs? Captain Williams closed the door and gestured for James to sit, another unusual departure from normal protocol that suggested this conversation would be unlike their typical professional exchanges. The older man's expression was thoughtful rather than stern, and he seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care. "I've received some interesting reports about your interactions with the younger members of the royal family," the captain began, and James felt his stomach drop in anticipation of formal censure. "But, before you assume this is a disciplinary matter, let me explain why I'm here." The captain opened a folder and consulted several pages of notes. "Princess Charlotte has been asking her tutors if there's any way she could formally request that you be allowed to answer questions about military history and traditions. Apparently, she's been quite persistent about it, even suggesting that educational conversations might fall outside normal guard protocols if they were officially sanctioned." James felt a mixture of surprise, admiration, and terror at the news. The young princess had apparently decided that if existing rules prevented their friendship, she would simply work to change the rules. It was an approach that demonstrated both political sophistication far beyond her years and a loyalty that made James's earlier silence feel even more cowardly. Meanwhile, Captain Williams continued, "Prince George has been researching the specific regulations that govern guard interactions with family members. He's discovered that there are provisions for educational exchanges in certain contexts, and he's prepared what amounts to a formal proposal for structured learning opportunities that would benefit both him and his sister." The picture that emerged from the captain's briefing was remarkable: two children who had responded to disappointment not with sulking or acceptance, but with systematic efforts to find solutions within the existing framework of royal protocols. They had treated James's silence not as personal rejection, but as an institutional problem that could potentially be solved through proper channels. "The most interesting development," the captain said with what might have been the beginning of a smile, "came this morning during young George's medical emergency. Apparently, he was asking for you specifically, wanting to know if you were safe, if you knew he was unwell, and whether someone had explained to you that his absence from your morning visits wasn't personal." James felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't name. While he had been standing rigidly at his post, tortured by his inability to offer comfort, Prince George had been worried about James's feelings during his own medical crisis. The generosity of spirit required for such concern seemed almost impossible to comprehend, let alone reciprocate appropriately. "The boy's fine, by the way," Captain Williams added, noticing James's expression. "Severe food poisoning from something he ate at a friend's house yesterday. Unpleasant but not dangerous. He should be back to normal activities within a day or two." The relief James felt at this news was so overwhelming that he had to consciously work to maintain his military posture. The thought of something serious happening to either child had become unbearable in ways that revealed just how much his emotional investment had grown over the past month. Captain Williams closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, studying James with the assessing gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating soldiers and their capabilities. "Here's the situation, Morrison. These children have somehow decided that you're worth fighting for, and they're using every resource at their disposal to make that fight official and legitimate. The question is whether you're worth the effort they're putting in." The challenge was implicit but unmistakable. James could continue hiding behind protocol and professional distance, using rules as an excuse to avoid the risk of genuine human connection. Or he could find the courage to step into the possibility that duty and compassion might actually strengthen each other rather than existing in permanent opposition. "There's a precedent for educational exchanges between guards and family members," the captain continued, "particularly when such exchanges serve legitimate pedagogical purposes and are conducted within appropriate boundaries. If you were interested in such an arrangement, and if you could demonstrate that your military knowledge and experience qualified you for informal educational duties, there might be a way to accommodate the children's requests." James realized he was being offered something unprecedented, an official pathway to acknowledge and develop the relationship that had been growing despite every effort to suppress it. But accepting would require him to admit that his emotional walls had already been breached, and to take responsibility for nurturing rather than simply protecting the connections that had formed. "The children have made it clear that they consider you a friend," Captain Williams said with surprising gentleness. "The question is whether you have the courage to be worthy of that friendship." As James walked back to his post 30 minutes later, his mind was spinning with possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. The crisis had revealed that the children's affection for him was deeper and more resilient than he had imagined, and that their determination to maintain their connection with him was stronger than any institutional barrier. They had seen something in him worth fighting for, even when he had been too afraid to fight for it himself. The remainder of his shift passed in a blur of internal preparation for conversations he had never thought possible. For the first time in 15 years, James was contemplating a form of service that honored both his expertise and his humanity, one that recognized that the strongest protection he could offer might not come from maintaining distance, but from building the kind of genuine connections that made protecting others feel like protecting family. When Princess Charlotte appeared at his post the next morning, her expression was cautious but hopeful. James made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. He looked down at her directly, smiled for the first time in his professional capacity, and said simply, "Good morning, Princess Charlotte. I hear you have some questions about military history." The transformation in her face was worth every risk he was taking. 6 months after that first morning greeting, James stood in a place he had never imagined he would be, the castle's small library, surrounded by books on military history, with Princess Charlotte and Prince George seated at a polished oak table, their notebooks open and their faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm that made teaching feel like the most important job in the world. The official arrangement had evolved gradually, with careful attention to both educational objectives and protocol requirements. 3 mornings a week, during designated educational periods, James was temporarily reassigned from guard duty to serve as a military history consultant for the children's expanded studies program. The sessions were supervised by Ms. Richardson, who had proven remarkably adept at balancing formal learning objectives with the more organic style of inquiry that characterized the children's interactions with James. "Today I want to understand about medals," Princess Charlotte announced, consulting her ever-present notebook. "Not just what they look like, but what people had to do to earn them and how it felt to receive them." Prince George nodded his agreement, then added, "And I've been reading about military engineering corps, but the books don't explain how the soldiers felt about building things instead of fighting things." "I thought you might know about that." James still experienced moments of surreal amazement at being asked such questions by members of the royal family, but the feeling had evolved from anxiety into gratitude. The children's genuine curiosity had awakened his own passion for the subjects he had studied throughout his military career, and their fresh perspectives often led him to consider familiar topics in entirely new ways. "Those are excellent questions," he said, settling into the comfortable rhythm that had developed during their sessions together. "Let's start with medals, because they represent something important about how we recognize different kinds of courage and service." He had brought several examples from his own collection, not to show off his achievements, but because the children learned better when they could examine real objects rather than just pictures in books. Princess Charlotte immediately gravitated toward a campaign medal from Afghanistan, running her small finger along the ribbon's edge with careful reverence. "This one is beautiful," she said softly. "But it looks sad too, somehow. Like it carries heavy memories." James felt his throat tighten with familiar emotion. Charlotte's intuitive understanding of the weight that military honors could carry had surprised him initially, but he had learned that children often possessed insights about human nature that adults spent years trying to articulate. Her observation about the medal containing memories was more accurate than she could possibly know. "You're right about that," he told her gently. "Medals honor important achievements, but they also remind us of times when people had to be braver than they wanted to be, or when difficult things happened to people we cared about." Prince George looked up from the engineering manual he had been studying alongside James's explanations. "Is that why some soldiers don't like to talk about their medals? Because talking about them means talking about the hard parts too?" The perceptiveness of the question caught James off guard, as the children's insights often did. George had identified something that many military families struggled to understand: why veterans sometimes seemed uncomfortable with recognition or reluctant to share stories about their service. It was a complex emotional territory that James had never expected to explore with 9- and 7-year-old children. "That's exactly right," James confirmed, feeling a deep respect for the boy's empathy. "Sometimes being honored for something reminds you of times when you couldn't help everyone you wanted to help, or when you had to make choices that were necessary but difficult." Charlotte looked up from the medal she had been examining. "Is that why you seemed sad sometimes when we first started talking to you? Because you were remembering difficult things?" The question pierced straight to the heart of something James had never fully acknowledged, even to himself. His years of emotional isolation hadn't just been about maintaining professional boundaries, they had also been about avoiding the vulnerability that came with sharing experiences that had shaped him profoundly. The children's willingness to engage with complex emotions had gradually given him permission to acknowledge feelings he had spent years suppressing. Yes, he said simply, finding that honesty felt both frightening and liberating. Sometimes remembering service means remembering times when you wished things could have been different. Ms. Richardson, who had been quietly observing from her corner desk, looked up with an expression of approval. The sessions had become educational for her as well, as she watched the children develop sophisticated understanding of concepts like duty, sacrifice, and moral complexity through their conversations with James. Their academic work had improved dramatically, but, more importantly, they were learning to think about difficult topics with nuance and empathy. The morning's lesson evolved organically, as they always did, into a broader discussion about different forms of service and the various ways people contributed to their communities. Prince George was fascinated by the engineering aspects of military construction, while Princess Charlotte was drawn to questions about how soldiers took care of each other during difficult times. James found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, finding ways to discuss complex experiences in terms that honored both the truth of what had happened and the children's capacity for understanding. "I think," Princess Charlotte said during a pause in their conversation, "that being a guard is like being a doctor for people's safety. You help keep people healthy in a different way." The comparison was so apt and so kindly intended that James felt his eyes water slightly. In her child's wisdom, she had found a way to reframe his work that emphasized care rather than distance, healing rather than barriers. It was a perspective that had never occurred to him during his years of military service, but it felt more accurate than any official job description he had ever read. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," he told her, meaning every word. "Doctors help people stay physically healthy, and guards help people stay safe and secure. Both jobs are about caring for others, even when the caring happens in different ways." Prince George nodded thoughtfully. "And both jobs require special training and knowledge that you have to keep learning about your whole life." "And both jobs," Charlotte added with the kind of insight that made her seem far older than 7, "are better when the person doing them really cares about the people they're helping, not just about following the rules." James realized that the children had articulated something he had been struggling to understand about the changes in his own approach to his work. Since beginning these educational sessions, his guard duties had felt different, more purposeful, more connected to genuine human welfare rather than abstract concepts of security. He was still following the same protocols and maintaining the same professional standards, but his motivation had shifted from mere compliance to genuine care for the people he was protecting. The transformation had been noticed by others as well. Captain Williams had mentioned during a recent evaluation that James seemed more alert and engaged during his shifts, more observant of subtle changes in the environment that might indicate emerging issues. Other guards had commented that he seemed more approachable, more willing to share information that might be helpful to their collective security efforts. "The funny thing," James told the children, "is that caring more about the people you're serving actually makes you better at the technical parts of your job too. When you're protecting people you genuinely care about, you pay attention to details you might miss if you were just following procedures." Ms. Richardson smiled from her corner desk, clearly pleased with the direction the conversation had taken. These sessions had accomplished far more than their original educational objectives. The children were developing sophisticated understanding of complex social and emotional concepts, but James was also clearly benefiting from the opportunity to reflect on his own experiences and to share his knowledge in a context that honored both his expertise and his humanity. As their formal lesson time came to an end, Princess Charlotte carefully returned the medal to its case with the reverent attention she always showed to important objects. "Thank you for sharing this with us," she said with the formal politeness that had been drilled into her from birth, but with a warmth that was entirely her own. "I understand now why medals are both beautiful and sad, and why they're so important." Prince George closed his engineering manual and added, "Next time, could we talk about how military engineers decide what to build and where to build it? I'm working on a project about infrastructure, and I think the planning process might be similar to what civilians do." James felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that had come to characterize these teaching sessions. The children's questions consistently challenged him to think about his experiences in new ways, and their enthusiasm for learning had reignited his own passion for understanding complex subjects. "I'd be happy to discuss that," he told George. "Engineering projects involve a lot of the same strategic thinking we use in security planning." As the children gathered their materials and prepared to return to their other studies, Charlotte paused at the library door and looked back at James. "I'm glad you decided to be our friend as well as our guard," she said with characteristic directness. "I think you're happier now than you were when we first met you." The observation was accurate in ways that James was still discovering. The past 6 months had taught him that the walls he had built to protect himself from emotional vulnerability had also prevented him from experiencing the joy that came with genuine human connection. Teaching the children had reminded him that sharing knowledge and experience with others who valued them was one of the most satisfying forms of service possible. As James returned to his guard duties that afternoon, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that first morning when Princess Charlotte had stopped to examine his uniform buttons. The children had seen something in him that he had forgotten existed, a capacity for warmth, wisdom, and meaningful contribution that extended far beyond his ability to stand motionless for hours at a time. The evening shift change provided him with an opportunity to speak briefly with Corporal Jenkins, who would be taking over his position. "Anything unusual to report?" Jenkins asked with their customary professional efficiency. James considered the question seriously, thinking about all the ways his definition of unusual had evolved over the past months. "Nothing concerning from a security standpoint," he replied. "But I wanted to mention that Princess Charlotte has been working on a project about military traditions, so she may ask you questions about your uniform or duties. She's genuinely interested in learning, not trying to distract from your work." Jenkins smiled with obvious amusement. "I heard you've become something of a celebrity with the younger generation around here. The other guards are curious about these educational sessions you're conducting." "They're remarkable children," James said, meaning it completely. "Curious, thoughtful, and surprisingly insightful about complex topics. Teaching them has reminded me why I originally chose military service, to protect people and institutions that make the world better." As he walked toward the castle exit that evening, James caught sight of Princess Charlotte's latest drawing displayed on a bulletin board in the staff corridor. It showed several figures in various uniforms: guards, medical staff, teachers, and maintenance workers, all standing together around a building that was clearly meant to represent the castle. The title, written in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, read, "All the people who take care of our home." In the drawing, James was positioned near the center of the group, his red uniform clearly recognizable, but his face was drawn with a smile that had not been present in her earlier artistic portraits. The transformation in that simple detail captured something fundamental about the changes that had occurred over the past months, not just in James's relationship with the children, but in his understanding of what it meant to serve others with both competence and compassion. Walking home through the quiet streets of Windsor that evening, James realized that the children had given him something invaluable: permission to be fully human while still maintaining the highest professional standards. They had shown him that genuine care enhanced rather than compromised effective service, and that the strongest protection he could offer was built not on emotional distance, but on the deep commitment that came from truly knowing and valuing the people whose safety and well-being had been entrusted to him. The guard had stood firm, just as he always had. But now he stood firm for reasons that honored both duty and love, service and connection, the ancient traditions of his profession and the timeless human need for meaningful relationships. In learning to be a teacher, he had remembered how to be completely, authentically himself.